On the morning of May 23, 1939, the United States Navy submarine Squalus lay motionless on the surface of the Atlantic, some 15 miles off the coast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The air was crisp, the sea was calm. It was a perfect day for the Squalus and her 59-man crew to conduct a series of standard drills. Among the most critical of these was a practice dive, a routine procedure that tested the boat's ability to submerge quickly and efficiently. The Squalus was a modern vessel, one of the new Sargo-class submarines, and her crew was confident and highly trained. Her commander, Lieutenant Oliver Naquin, was a seasoned and respected officer. There was no reason to expect anything other than a successful exercise. The dive began precisely at 8:40 a.m. The signal was given, the hatch was sealed, and the crew initiated the standard sequence. Ballast tanks were flooded with water to decrease buoyancy, and the submarine began its descent beneath the waves. But then, at a depth of about 50 feet, a catastrophe occurred. A critical mechanical failure, later determined to be a faulty induction valve, a large main air intake, failed to close. Instead of sealing the engine room from the sea, the valve remained open, creating a direct, massive inlet for the ocean. The result was instantaneous and violent. Sea water, under immense pressure, roared into the aft engine room. It was a torrential, unstoppable flood. Within seconds, the rear compartments of the 310-foot-long submarine were filled with thousands of gallons of freezing North Atlantic water. The Squalus, now drastically heavy in the stern, pitched downward and began a rapid, uncontrolled descent. The crew fought to arrest the dive. Emergency orders were shouted. Blowing the main ballast tanks, the standard procedure to surface, was attempted, but it was too late. The weight of the water in the aft sections was too great. The submarine, now a dying vessel, plunged toward the ocean floor. Lieutenant Naquin, in the control room, made a split-second decision that would prove fateful. As the watertight door between the control room and the flooded aft sections began to descend, he ordered it sealed shut. This act, a brutal necessity of submarine protocol, tragically trapped and condemned the men in the engine and aft torpedo rooms. The roar of the inrushing water was replaced by a chilling silence, punctuated by the sounds of the hull groaning under pressure. The Squalus slammed into the muddy seabed 243 feet below the surface. The impact was jarring. The lights flickered and died, and emergency battery-powered lighting cast an eerie glow throughout the forward compartments. The immediate situation was dire. 26 men were dead, drowned almost instantly in the aft sections. 33 survivors were now trapped in the forward part of the submarine, the control room, the torpedo room, and the crew's quarters. They were encased in a steel tomb under nearly 110 pounds per square inch of pressure, in complete darkness, and in water that was just a few degrees above freezing. The outside world was 243 feet away, a distance that was, for all practical purposes in 1939, as unreachable as the moon. The cold began to seep in, a relentless chill that promised a slow, hypothermic to death. The air, already growing stale, would only last for a limited time. Carbon dioxide would soon begin to build to lethal levels. The Squalus and her 33 surviving crew members were stranded at the bottom of the sea. The news of the Squalus's failure to surface sent a shockwave through the naval base at Portsmouth. The submarine's sister ship, the Sculpin, which was also conducting exercises, was immediately dispatched to the last known position. By a stroke of immense fortune, the Sculpin located a marker buoy that had been released from the Squalus. Attached to it was a telephone cable and a written message confirming the disaster and the location of the sunken sub. The rescue operation was on, but it was a race against a rapidly expiring clock. The men on the bottom had at best 3 days of breathable air. The entire hope of the rescue rested on a device that many in the Navy considered a fascinating but largely impractical novelty: the McCann Rescue Chamber. This bell-like device was the brainchild of Lieutenant Commander Charles Swede Mompson and Alan McCann. Mommsen was already famous for inventing the Mommsen lung, an emergency escape breathing apparatus. The McCann Chamber was his and McCann's more ambitious project for crew-wide rescue. The chamber itself was a bizarre-looking apparatus. It was a pear-shaped metal bell, 9 feet tall and 7 feet wide, with a heavy, lower hatch that could mate with a submarine's deck hatch. It had no engine or propulsion of its own. It was lowered and raised from a surface ship by a thick steel cable. Its operation was complex. It had ballast tanks to control its buoyancy, compressed air to blow water out of its bottom compartment, and a system for replenishing oxygen and scrubbing carbon dioxide. Most critically, it had a rubber gasket around its bottom rim, designed to form a watertight seal against the escape hatch of a submarine. In theory, the chamber would be lowered, mate with the submarine's hatch, and the trapped sailors could climb in. The lower hatch would be closed, the water in the chamber pumped out, and the entire apparatus would be winched back to the surface. It was a brilliant theory, but in practice it had never been used in a real deep water emergency. Its testing had been limited and in controlled conditions. Many senior officers were deeply skeptical. They saw it as a complex, fragile solution to a problem that was, statistically, almost always fatal. The prevailing wisdom was that if a submarine went down, the crew was lost. The McCann Chamber was a hope, not a guarantee. The man tasked with overseeing its use was the man who believed in it most, Lieutenant Commander Mommsen himself. He immediately flew from Washington to New Hampshire to take direct command of the rescue effort. The Navy's best deep-sea divers were also rushed to the scene. The rescue ship USS Falcon, specially fitted to handle the chamber, was dispatched. But the weather, initially calm, began to deteriorate. Swells picked up, and a thick fog rolled in, threatening to halt the delicate operation before it could even begin. On the bottom, the survivors of the Squalus could do nothing but wait, conserve their air, and hope that the theoretical device they had only heard about in briefings could actually perform a miracle. The first and most formidable challenge was simply getting divers down to the Squalus to prepare the submarine's hatch for the chamber. At a depth of 243 feet, this was far beyond the normal operating limits for divers in 1939. The pressure was crushing, and the risk of nitrogen narcosis, the rapture of the deep, which impairs judgment and motor skills, was extremely high. Furthermore, the cold was debilitating. The lead divers, Chief Boatswain's mate Martin Sibitsky and others, descended into the dark, frigid water, guided only by the marker buoy line. After a tense descent, Sibitsky's boots touched the steel hull of the Squalus. He made his way to the escape hatch and, following a prearranged signal, tapped out the classic shave and a haircut rhythm with his wrench. For a moment there was silence. Then from inside the steel tomb came the clear, unmistakable reply, 2 taps, 6 bits. It was a moment of profound, almost spiritual significance. After hours of silence and dread, the men on the surface and the men trapped below knew they were in contact. The survivors were alive. The divers' work was grueling and dangerous. They had to clear the hatch of any debris and attach a downhaul cable, a guideline that would help position the heavy rescue chamber directly over the hatch. Working in near-total darkness, fighting the disorienting effects of narcosis and the numbing cold, the divers succeeded. But time was running out. The air supply inside the Squalus was dwindling, and the weather on the surface was growing worse. The decision was made to send the chamber down on its first rescue attempt that evening. The first descent of the McCann Chamber was a nerve-shredding ordeal. Lowered from the heaving deck of the Falcon, it was swung out over the water and began its slow journey into the abyss. Inside the chamber were 2 volunteer operators. Their job was to guide the descent, manage the ballast, and, most critically, mate the chamber with the Squalus. The cable groaned under the strain. On the surface, Mommsen and the crew of the Falcon could only wait and monitor the telephone line connecting them to the chamber. The first attempt failed. The chamber reached the hull but could not achieve a proper seal on the first try. It had to be hauled all the way back to the surface, a process that took hours. It was a devastating setback. Morale, which had been high after the divers' success, plummeted. For the men inside the Squalus, the sound of the chamber scraping against the hull and then leaving was a psychological blow. They had been moments from rescue, only to have it vanish. The air was growing foul. Men were becoming lethargic, a sure sign of carbon dioxide poisoning. Lieutenant Narquin ordered the use of soda lime, a chemical air purifier, which provided a temporary reprieve. But everyone knew the next attempt had to work. There would not be time for a third. At 11:30 a.m. on May 24th, the McCann Rescue Chamber was ready for its second descent. The weather had marginally improved, and the crew of the Falcon, though exhausted, was focused. The two operators, torpedo man First Class John Michalowski and Chief Metalsmith James MacDonald, climbed back into the cold, damp chamber. They knew the eyes of the nation and the lives of 33 men were on them. The chamber was swung out and began its slow, deliberate journey to the bottom. The descent was tense but controlled. This time, the operators used the experience from the first failure. They expertly maneuvered the chamber using the downhaul cable to guide it into position. Through the telephone link, they reported their progress. Finally, the word came, chamber seated. They had successfully mated with the Squalus's escape hatch. On the surface, a wave of cautious relief spread through the command center. But the most dangerous part was just beginning. Inside the Squalus, the survivors heard the clang of metal on metal as the chamber settled onto their hull. Lieutenant Narquin ordered his men to prepare. The procedure was to open the submarine's lower hatch, allowing water to flood the airlock space between the two hatches. Then the crew would open the chamber's lower hatch from the inside, climb in, seal it, and have the water pumped out. It was a counterintuitive and frightening process, deliberately letting the sea into their last sanctuary. The first group of 7 survivors, chosen by Narquin, gathered in the escape trunk. When the hatch was cracked, seawater burst in, but the chamber above held. The men, one by one, scrambled up into the safety of the bell. Michalowski and MacDonald secured the lower hatch and gave the signal to the Falcon. Ready to hoist. The winch engines on the Falcon strained, and the cable began to retract. The chamber, now carrying 9 men, began its slow, deliberate ascent from the ocean floor. It had to be raised slowly with frequent pauses to allow for decompression and to prevent the chamber from shooting to the surface uncontrollably. After an agonizingly slow journey, the chamber broke the surface. It was hauled onto the deck of the Falcon, and the hatch was opened. The first 7 survivors, pale, shivering but alive, emerged into the daylight. They were immediately wrapped in blankets and taken below deck. The rescue had worked. The first round trip was a complete success. A cheer went up among the rescue fleet. The Impractical diving bell was proving its worth. Michalowski and MacDonald, after a brief rest, immediately volunteered to go back down. The chamber was readied and began its second trip. The process was repeated. Another group of survivors was loaded, and the chamber made its second successful ascent. With each trip, confidence grew. But the operation was far from over. Night was falling again, and the weather remained a threat. The chamber would have to make multiple trips to bring all 33 men to the surface. Through the night and into the next day, the McCann chamber made trip after trip. The routine, while still dangerous, was becoming established. The operators, working in shifts, displayed incredible endurance and courage, descending repeatedly into the dark, high-pressure environment. On the bottom, the conditions inside the Squalus were worsening. The air was thick and toxic. Men were suffering from headaches, nausea, and extreme fatigue. But the steady rhythm of the rescues kept hope alive. Lieutenant Commander Mompson, on the Falcon, faced a critical decision. The chamber was designed to carry a maximum of 8 or 9 people per trip, in addition to the 2 operators. To get all 33 survivors out, it required 4 trips. However, on what was planned to be the third trip, a new problem emerged. As the chamber was being lowered, the steel cable became fouled. It was a nightmare scenario. The chamber, with its 2 operators inside, was stuck, dangling partway to the bottom. If the cable snapped, it would mean a catastrophic fall and the certain death of the operators. For hours, the crew on the Falcon worked frantically to free the tangled cable. The operators inside the chamber remained calm, communicating their status. Down in the Squalus, the remaining survivors waited in the worsening atmosphere, unaware of the new crisis unfolding above them. Finally, after a tense and skillful operation, the sailors on the Falcon managed to free the cable. The chamber was hauled back to the surface, inspected, and found to be undamaged. The third trip was completed successfully, retrieving another group of sailors. Now, only one trip remained. Lieutenant Narquin and his remaining officers were the last men in the submarine. They had ensured their crew went first. The final descent of the chamber was perhaps the most emotionally charged. When it seated on the hull for the last time, Narquin and his men went through the now familiar drill of flooding the trunk and climbing into the bell. The last man out sealed the Squalus's hatch for the final time. The ascent was slow and deliberate. When the chamber broke the surface for the fourth and final time, the rescue was complete. All 33 survivors from the sunken Squalus were safe. The operators, exhausted but triumphant, emerged to a hero's welcome. The news was flashed around the world. The deepest submarine rescue in history had been successful. The men were transported to the naval hospital, where they would recover from their ordeal. The Squalus itself would later be salvaged in an incredible feat of engineering, but that day belonged to the survivors and the men of the rescue fleet. The rescue of the Squalus crew was more than a dramatic news story. It was a watershed moment for the United States Navy and for submarine warfare worldwide. It transformed submarine service from a near-suicidal duty into a viable, if still incredibly dangerous, branch of the military. The successful use of the McCann Rescue Chamber validated years of pioneering work by visionaries like Charles Mompson and provided a tangible, proven life-saving technology. In the immediate aftermath, the Navy launched a full court of inquiry to determine the cause of the induction valve failure. The findings led to immediate modifications to the entire submarine fleet, making such a catastrophic failure far less likely. The heroes of the rescue were rightly celebrated. Lieutenant Commander Mompson and the lead diver, Martin Sibitsky, were awarded the Medal of Honor. The operators of the chamber, John Michalowski and James MacDonald, along with others, received the Navy Cross. Their courage was etched into naval history. The McCann Rescue Chamber became a standard piece of equipment for the U.S. Navy's submarine rescue forces. While the specific design has been superseded by modern deep submergence rescue vehicles, DSRVs, and systems like the Submarine Rescue Diving and Recompression System, SRDRS, the fundamental principle remains the same: a specialized bell or submersible that can mate with a disabled submarine's hatch. The lessons learned from the Squalus rescue in diving medicine, rescue coordination, and equipment design formed the bedrock of all future international submarine rescue protocols. The story of the Squalus endures as a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and resilience. It is the story of a device deemed impractical that became the only hope for 33 men. It is the story of the commander who sealed a door to save some, and the rescuers who refused to give up on those who remained. It demonstrated that even in the most hopeless of situations, trapped in a steel coffin on the dark ocean floor, the will to survive, coupled with scientific innovation and raw bravery, could defy the odds. The Squalus rescue proved that no sailor was beyond saving, a principle that guides naval rescue operations to this day.